Hi everybody, welcome back to Moral Psychology with me, Dr. Josh Redstone, and today's lecture is all about moral motivation, and we'll be covering Chapter 3 from our course textbook here, entitled Moral Motivation by Timothy Schrader, Adina Roskies, and Sean Nichols. So, let's get started. So, before we get started looking at the particular theories of moral motivation that are discussed in this chapter, one thing that I wanted to mention was that this chapter spans several of what philosophers and cognitive scientists sometimes call levels of analysis. And this has actually been true of a couple of the things we've talked about so far, and will be true of some of the other chapters that we'll cover. But I thought I'd better clarify what this means. What is this idea of levels of analysis? There's a couple ways to break this down. I indicate in the slides, for example, that today's chapter covers the philosophical, the psychological, and the neurological. And when I'm talking about levels of analysis here, what I mean is that each of these areas, philosophy, psychology, or neuroscience, is aimed at either a more abstract or more concrete level of analysis, or a higher or lower level of spatial and temporal granularity. So philosophy is, at least when we're talking about stuff like this that's tied into psychology and neurology, would be a very high level kind of discipline. The kinds of things we would do there would be on a higher level of analysis than the other two disciplines. And that's because philosophy is very abstract. Moving down to psychology, well, psychology, no matter the discipline of psychology that you're talking about, is generally concerned with the behavior of the organism. And it's less abstract than philosophy. It doesn't so much concern itself with broad, say, for example, metaphysical theories about minds. Rather, psychologists build information processing models of particular cognitive faculties that we have, for example. They might model things like working memory or something like that, right? Rather than concern themselves with these big metaphysical questions about the mind. So psychology sits at a lower level of analysis than does philosophy. And neuroscience, of course, is at a lower level of analysis because although in some branches of neuroscience, we're concerned with the whole organism. In other branches, we're concerned with what's going on in just particular areas of the brain, or how the synaptic connections between different kinds of neurons work. And we can even go smaller than this and study the electrochemical messengers that operate in those synapses. And this, of course, happens on a much smaller scale, spatially, and over much shorter periods of time, temporally, than, say, the things that psychologists are interested in. So that's what I mean by levels of analysis. Up until now, I've just kind of been gesturing toward the interdisciplinarity of some of the work we've been looking at. But this is one of the things that makes it very interdisciplinary, or at least, well, I shouldn't say that. Actually, perhaps it'd be more accurate to say that with interdisciplinary work, you should keep in mind the levels of analysis that you're spanning, from big metaphysical theories to perhaps the behavior or the cognition of an individual organism, to what particular bits and pieces of an organism's brain are doing. So those are all kinds of different levels of analyses, and this chapter spans all of those, as does a lot of the material that we will be covering. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. So today's chapter, Chapter 3, is all about moral motivation. Now that we've talked about levels of analysis, we can get right onto the main topic. So what is moral motivation? Well, moral motivation here refers to whatever motivates people to do morally good deeds. So there's an example on page 72, which I'll just read here, that the authors give us. So, quote, Jen is walking down the street when a homeless man asks her for money. She stops and gives him $1, wishes him well, and walks on. Jen appears to have done a morally good deed. But now, what motivated her to do it? So that's what the authors mean by moral motivation. What is it that makes us behave in morally good ways? What is it that makes us, or what is it that motivates us to perform morally good acts, and to avoid performing morally questionable acts? That's what this chapter is all about. So before we get to the particular theories of moral motivation, I want to say a little bit more about motivation in general, following the authors of this text. And they define motivation as a psychological state. So motivation is, I suppose if you want to think of it a bit like a propositional attitude kind of thing. In fact, although I say in my slides here that the authors don't really talk about motivation in terms of propositional attitude psychology or folk psychology or common sense psychology, as it's sometimes called, upon a few additional readings, I do think they are treating it this way. They're just not explicitly talking about propositional attitude psychology, and that's fine. If you're not familiar with this, let me know in the comments section. I'll try to get anyone who's not up to speed on propositional attitude psychology. But basically, it's the idea that we make sense of people's behaviors by appealing to mental states, and that those mental states play a causal role in the production of behavior. So, for example, if I'm thirsty, that means I'll form a desire to quench my thirst. And perhaps I also I have certain beliefs about what's in my fridge, namely that there's some sparkling water or something in my fridge. So my belief that there's sparkling water in my fridge and my desire to satisfy my thirst interact in such a way that I get up and go to the fridge to take out a can of sparkling water and satisfy my thirst. So that's a very, very brief sort of example of the kinds of things we do with propositional attitude psychology. And the authors hold that motivation is this kind of psychological state, or is an example of this kind of psychological state. It plays a causal role in the production of our action in the same way that my belief that there's something that will satisfy my thirst in the fridge and my desire to quench my thirst cause me to form other intentions and desires, and I get up and walk to the fridge and take out a beverage and drink it. So motivation isn't some kind of philosophical abstraction. It's not epiphenomenal. It's a real psychological state, and it plays a role in producing action. So that's one important takeaway. Now, motivation as this kind of psychological state has, according to these authors, 4 distinct features. These help separate motivation from action itself, even though, as we'll see, motivation is related to action, and from other kinds of mental states like, say, standing desires. So, the first feature of motivation is that motivation is closely related to action, yet distinct from it. So, if we perform action A, that is because we've been motivated to perform that action in some sense. So it's closely related to it. But we can always decide not to A, even if we're motivated to A, right? So in that way, motivation is closely related to action, but it's not the same thing as action. It might give us the force we need to go on and carry out some action, but it is not the same thing. They are distinct things. Moving on, characteristic number 2 of motivation is that motivation is a causally efficacious kind of state. So what does that mean? Well, our motivational states, as I've sort of hinted at before, are causally related to the production of action. So on the first point, when I said that motivation is related to action yet distinct from it, yeah, they're not the same thing, and yet motivation does play a causal role in the initiation of action. And that's what characteristic number 2 is all about. There could be other psychological mechanisms at play here, perhaps mechanisms that inhibit the production of action. That's fine. But motivation is nonetheless an important contributor to the production of action. Number 3, motivation is occurrent. Occurrent, that's not a word you hear very often. What does that mean? Well, occurrent means, there's like an actual instance or a specific time and place where something happens. If something is occurrent, it means there's an instance of it happening, right? So here we're talking about something that's not just hypothetical. We're talking about things that actually occur. And what the authors mean here is that motivation is occurrent in the sense that it is distinct from standing desires, right? Like I might have a standing desire to feed the hungry or to bring about world peace. But that standing desire may not cause me to act in such a way that I work towards alleviating hunger or bringing about world peace, right? Motivation, if I were motivated to do so, would do that. So although I might have a standing desire for something, perhaps my standing desire is causally inert in a lot of cases, and what I need is really not a standing desire, but a motivation to bring about some action, right? So, in the appropriate circumstances, motivation will cause action, and those appropriate circumstances sort of form the particular times and places, and that's what makes motivation occurrent. And that is what differentiates motivation from long-standing desires, if that makes sense. And on to the final characteristic, motivation is associated with certain feelings. Now, these feelings could be affective or they could be somatic. If you remember from our last lecture, affective refers to feelings that have something to do with the moods or the emotions, right? And we're going to talk about moods and emotions a lot more in our next lecture. But in any case, you might feel a range of emotions when you're in a state of motivation. Maybe you feel really up to the challenge of doing something. I had to make this video today because I'm a little bit behind on the video lectures. And I was feeling particularly up to it today. I was just feeling very, let's get up and let's go and let's make a video lecture. So that's an affective example, right? Of a feeling that's associated with my state of motivation. But feelings accompanying motivation might also be just somatic. So these are just bodily feelings, and these are things which are not necessarily emotions, but which nonetheless feel like something. I mentioned in the previous lecture, for example, that pain and pleasure, maybe some people would consider pain and pleasure affective, whereas others would consider them somatic. I myself would consider pain and pleasure simply somatic states. Emotions are a lot more complex than somatic states, and they're elicited by particular things, whereas a somatic state is usually, I guess, tends not to be a result of a particular event that happens to you, like emotions are. But again, we'll be getting into this in much more detail in the next lecture, which is about moral emotions. So, moral motivation. We're still talking about motivation generally. Motivation in general, so far we've seen, is related to action yet distinct from it. It's causally efficacious, which means it can bring about action. It can cause us to bring about action. It's associated with certain feelings, and it's occurrent. Okay, that's motivation in general. But we're interested in moral motivation specifically in this chapter. So we need to talk about what distinguishes moral motivation from motivation, plain and simple. And that's what we'll be doing now as we discuss various philosophical frameworks for understanding moral emotion and understanding moral motivation and how each of those frameworks, where each of those frameworks, I suppose, assigns the motivation in the particular scenarios that we're going to consider. Scenarios like Jen giving the $1 to the homeless person. Anyway, let's get into that now. All right, so the authors of this chapter offer us 4 sort of sketches or caricatures of these traditional philosophical accounts of moral motivation. Now, I want to emphasize these are merely sketches. They're not meant to be detailed defenses or arguments for these positions. But they will simplify things sufficiently for our discussion, and we'll also be able to apply each of them to the example given at the beginning of the lecture and in the beginning of this chapter about Jen giving the dollar to the homeless man. Now, these four approaches are the instrumentalist, the cognitivist, the sentimentalist, and the personalist. So let's take a look at how each of those four theories of moral motivation work, what they say constitutes moral motivation, and also what moral theoretic frameworks that they align with. So let's begin with the instrumentalist. So on an instrumentalist account of moral motivation, one is in a state of motivation when one forms the right kinds of beliefs about how to satisfy these pre-existing desires. So these pre-existing desires we will call intrinsic desires, or at least the kinds of pre-existing desires that are important in the instrumentalist account are intrinsic desires. So what is an intrinsic desire? Well, a desire is intrinsic if the thing that I desire is desired for its own sake. If I desire, for example, X for its own sake, then my desire is intrinsic. But if my desire for X is merely because it will satisfy a different desire, Y, then we'll say that that's an instrumental desire. Not all desires are intrinsic nor instrumental. I mean, there's a lot of both. But if I desire, to make it more concrete, if I desire to do good, if I'm like a good Kantian and I desire to do good just for its own sake, well, that would be an intrinsic desire. But if I desire to do good simply for the praise of others, then what I really desire is that praise. And my desire to do good is merely instrumental to my desire to be praised. So that's the difference between an instrumental desire and an intrinsic desire. Now, the instrumentalist will hold that all moral motivation, if it's going to count as moral motivation, has to involve intrinsic desires and not instrumental desires. But intrinsic desires are not everything that we need here on the instrumentalist account. So we could say that intrinsic desires are necessary for moral motivation, or for a state of motivation to count as moral motivation, but it's not sufficient. Obviously, they have to be desires, intrinsic desires that are already sort of, about moral or ethical things, the good and so forth, right? But we also need something else. We need these intrinsic desires together with occurrent beliefs, right? So we talked about motivation being an occurrent state. Well, on the instrumentalist account, we don't get motivation unless we have an intrinsic desire and an occurrent belief. For example, if I have an intrinsic desire that P and an occurrent belief that I can bring about P with action A, then I become motivated to take action A. So if I have an intrinsic desire to bring about world peace, well, that's great that I have this standing intrinsic desire. But if I believe that I can bring about world peace by perhaps becoming a politician, working my way up the ladder, and developing the right kinds of policies, then I'll become motivated to take those kinds of actions and do those things in order to bring about my standing desire for world peace. And that would count as a case of moral motivation. So on the instrumentalist account, it's a bit confusing because intrinsic desires are taken to be essential, but instrumental desires are pretty important, and it's called instrumentalism, so it's a little bit murky on a first pass, but basically moral motivation on an instrumentalist framework is all about having intrinsic desires and then the right kinds of beliefs together with the instrumental desire to bring about the intrinsic desire, or to realize the intrinsic desire, we could say. It's a little bit confusing. But essentially, I need to have standing desires beliefs that by taking certain actions that are instrumental towards achieving those desires, and if I have those things, then I'll become motivated to act in such a way to bring about those intrinsic desires. Okay, so that's instrumentalism. Now, how would an instrumentalist account for Jen's good deed of giving the homeless man $1? Well, we can break it down like this, as the authors do in chapter 3. So Jen perhaps has a desire to do what is right. She has an intrinsic desire just to do what is right, whenever she can, all the time. And then she forms the belief when she passes by the homeless man that by giving him $1, she'll be doing what's right. So then she develops this a current instrumental desire to give the homeless man $1 because she has a standing desire to do good, and the belief that by giving the man $1, she will be doing good. And that sort of motivates her by giving her this instrumental desire to bring about her standing desire to have done what is right in this case. So Jen is acting on this instrumental desire to give the man $1, and in so doing, she's actually acting in the service of bringing about or realizing her intrinsic desire to do the right thing. And an instrumentalist would say that her act has moral worth because it's the product of a desire for a moral good, namely to do the right thing. So that's how an instrumentalist would understand moral motivation in the case of Jen and the homeless man. Okay, so that's it for instrumentalism. Let's move on now to the cognitivist account of moral motivation. Now, on the cognitivist account, the idea that moral motivation begins with desire is not really featured. It doesn't really feature. Instead, as the name implies, for the cognitivist, belief plays a much more important role in the production of moral action than do these standing intrinsic desires do. So, for a cognitivist, well, a cognitivist believes that desire is just something that helps you bring about a behavioral impulse. So a cognitivist is going to reject the idea that the right kind of behavioral impulses, these instrumental desires and occurrent beliefs under the instrumentalist framework, are going to be the sources of morally worthy actions. Instead, for the cognitivist, moral motivation begins with the proper kinds of occurrent belief rather than standing desires interacting with occurrent beliefs to produce instrumental desires. So, what kind of occurrent beliefs? Well, beliefs about what kinds of actions that are available to us that would be right in the present circumstances. And these beliefs, these occurrent beliefs, lead to motivation to perform morally worthy actions independently of long-standing intrinsic desires. So, a cognitivist might think of the state of motivation as a desire, but the cognitivist would also argue that this state of desire or the state of motivation is independent of the moral belief that created it. So, how would a cognitivist account for Jen's good deed? Maybe we can make this a little bit more concrete this way. Well, Jen's desire to do what is right isn't really relevant here when it comes to doing the good deed that she did, giving the man $1. It doesn't initiate her actions either, really, according to the cognitivist. What does initiate her action is the belief that it's right to help the homeless man. That's what motivates her to give the man $1. And her action in this case would have moral worth because it's generated by the right kind of belief or caused by the right kind of belief, namely a belief about what would be right in that set of circumstances. Her desires are not so much important here because her desires we could think of as a bit like maybe like data that she might consider before reaching that state of motivation to give the man $1 or to avoid giving the man $1. But she can come to believe that it would be right to give this man $1 without considering these desires. So that's why a cognitivist would say that these standing desires aren't what are important. What are really important are the right kinds of occurrent beliefs, namely what would be the right thing to do in that situation. And that's why it's called cognitivism, and that is the cognitivist framework, or at least the sketch of the cognitivist framework. All right, so next up is sentimentalism and the sentimentalist account of moral motivation. Well, sentimentalism, as the name implies, is going to focus a lot on emotions playing a causal role in moral motivation. So we could talk about a strong sentimentalist, as the authors of this chapter do, who would hold that actions don't count as being morally motivated unless those actions are driven by moral emotions. So to have moral motivation, an action has to have been driven by a moral emotion, and then that action would count as having been morally motivated. Again, we haven't really looked at moral emotions in too much detail. I've kind of mentioned a few here and there, like disgust and shame and guilt. Anger is another one. We'll encounter all of these in chapter 4, by the way, of this textbook. But for now, let's look at a pretty good candidate for moral emotions, which, according to the authors of this chapter, is what we call compassion. So, let's say, for example, that you're motivated to save an injured child, or if not save, at least help an injured child, because you feel compassion for the child. So if that compassion motivates you to help the injured child, then on the sentimentalist account, your motivation counts as specifically moral motivation. Now, specifying why certain emotionally driven motivations and not others count as moral is a challenge for the sentimentalist. In other words, there's a question about what kinds of emotions really do count as moral emotions, right? I mean, anger can certainly be a moral emotion sometimes. Anger is typically understood as a response toward a transgression against you or some kind of perceived injustice. And in those cases, then certainly we could regard anger as a moral emotion. But in other cases, there is, at least, I guess if we're being objective, if you can be objective when it comes to the emotions, there are cases when people are angry when they shouldn't be, and obviously this would not count as an example of moral anger. Guilt and shame are pretty good examples of moral emotions, but disgust is a difficult one because, I mean, we feel disgust when certain moral transgressions, like perhaps crimes against nature or crimes against divinity, or the violation of certain like taboos, like food taboos or sexual taboos, are committed. And in those cases, we would certainly regard that as disgusting. But sometimes we can just be disgusted, and disgust in this case doesn't function, as a moral emotion, but just as a kind of harm avoidance emotion. Perhaps we'd be disgusted by something just because it might make us sick, and feeling disgusted, by things like, things that can make us ill, like vomit or feces or, those kinds of disgusting things. That's a good way. That's a good way to keep motivated to stay away from those things and to not become ill and not harm yourself. So, there's a lot of gray area here. And complex emotional phenomena like empathy and sympathy make this even more difficult. Empathy and sympathy aren't really emotions in their own right so much as they are ways of coming to experience the emotions that other people are feeling, or at least, if not the exact same emotion, then a similarly valenced kind of emotion to what they're feeling. And again, we'll cover this when we talk about moral emotions in more detail. Compassion arguably is a kind of sympathy or empathy, but that just makes this even more complicated. So we're not going to be able to deal with this here, but just keep in mind that this can be a bit of a challenge, right? Specifying why certain emotionally driven motivations count as moral, whereas others don't, depends on whether you can convincingly argue whether in such and such a case this emotion was a moral emotion. but we'll get into that in more detail next time. For now, let's talk about how a sentimentalist would make sense of Jen's good deed. Well, Jen sees the homeless man, right, and she feels compassion for him. So let's just take it for granted that compassion is a moral emotion. Her compassion here is what motivates her to treat the man kindly. And one way to treat the man kindly would be to give him $1. So Jen reaches into her pocket and gives him $1. So if we grant that compassion is a moral emotion, then because Jen's compassion for the homeless man was the motivation for her action, and her action has moral worth, we can say in this case that this was a case of moral emotion. Sorry, I keep doing that. Moral motivation rather than, plain old regular motivation. Finally, we come to the personalist account of moral motivation. The instrumentalist and the cognitivist, I think, are fairly straightforward and can be mapped on in a number of ways to various ethical theories. The sentimentalist obviously lines up very nicely with sentimentalism. And the personalist actually lines up, as we'll see, very well with a sort of virtue ethics framework, if you like. In any case, the previous three accounts all appeal in some way to mental states, like beliefs and desires, occurrent beliefs, intrinsic desires, instrumental desires, all those lovely different kinds of things. But a personalist takes a more holistic view of things. And a personalist is going to say that morally worthy actions stem from good character. Now, good character involves a lot of different things. It involves knowledge of the good. It involves wanting what is good for its own sake. You have to have long-standing dispositions or character traits. In this chapter, they're referred to as habits, but a lot of virtue ethicists distinguish between habits and character traits, in that character traits are more virtuous than mere habit. In any case, that we won't get into that in much detail here, but we need these long-standing dispositions to favor good actions. We need these long-standing habits of responding to your own knowledge, your own emotions, your own desires with good actions. And this is kind of what makes this a virtue ethics kind of account of moral motivation, right? I mean, all of this it's not really about acting from particular duties or from particular moral principles or rules about maximizing welfare or preventing harm. It all really has to do with good character. So knowledge of the good here, for example, could be realized in terms of, I don't know, some kind of heuristics, or even something like phronesis or practical wisdom, which is the tendency to respond appropriately based on what the circumstances dictate. In other words, as the ancient Greeks might have put it, knowledge of how to determine which ends are the best, and not only that, knowledge of how to bring them about. So phronesis or practical wisdom, also sometimes translated as prudence. And of course, character, the right kinds of habits and dispositions are very important here. And this can all be developed, kind of like a skill, right? This is something that Aristotle certainly would have advocated for. Being good, being a good person is something you have to practice doing. Not like you sit in your room and practice by yourself like I do when I practice the guitar, but something you have to practice by doing it in your life, gaining more experience, gaining more of that practical wisdom. So we need these good habits and dispositions, these character traits, which are all basically these complexes of morally worthy, emotional or dispositional or cognitive habits, right? Things that we call virtues. So, a personalist account of Jen's good deed. Well, Jen, in this case, is a bit like a particularist. A moral particularist is somebody who doesn't really have any, moral code that's like set in stone. Rather, what is right depends on particular circumstances. So, an action that's right in one situation may not be right in another situation. So Jen holds no explicit belief about what's right in each and every circumstance. So she's a bit of a particularist here. But she's got a sensitivity to certain moral patterns, we'll call them, thanks to her perhaps character traits, moral heuristics, which are like rules of thumb about how to do the good. Her heuristics, her character traits, her habits, all of this stuff lead her to believe that in this particular case, it would be right to give the homeless man $1. So all of this is a matter of character. So we could say that thanks to Jen's character, the right kinds of emotions or the right kinds of desires, all of this stuff is elicited by the particular circumstances that she's in. And that is what leads her to give the man $1. So she's exercising a virtue, in this case, compassion. And since her action was the result of good character, she has this good character trait, compassion. She's worked out that this is a time and place where it would be good to exercise that compassion using her practical wisdom. This is what gives Jen's actions moral worth. So much for the personalist account. So we've just gone over these 4 sort of sketches or caricatures. Now these are all different philosophical accounts of moral motivation. On each one of these, what makes motivation count as specifically moral depends on perhaps your character, if you're a personalist, or on the right kinds of intrinsic desires and the right kinds of occurrent beliefs and instrumental desires for the instrumentalist, the right kinds of beliefs for a cognitivist, and the right kinds of emotions for a sentimentalist. So all very philosophical, but even though they're philosophical, the authors are excited about the fact that they entail certain empirical predictions. So we're not going to discuss all of this in super detail because, again, this is a philosophy class, but just be aware that as we go through the rest of this chapter, we're starting to move down from a higher level of analysis, a sort of philosophical level of analysis, down to a more psychological or neurological level of analysis. Just keep that in mind. So, with that said, let's go on to discuss the neurophysiology. So, with all of that in mind, let us go on to discuss the neurophysiology of moral motivation. All right, on to the neurophysiology of moral motivation. Now, apologies in advance, because this is kind of a dry area of the chapter, unless you happen to be into neuroscience and all of that fun stuff. But in any case, this part of the chapter is going to give us a really cool look at the, I guess, neurological nuts and bolts, the machinery, the mental machinery that underwrites motivation in general, and in specifically moral motivation. And we will see how the authors make case for these different brain regions, higher and lower, and so on and so forth, being involved in moral motivation and the production of morally good deeds. So, moral motivation has to be connected to voluntary action in some way or another, because moral motivation causes us to act, to perform these morally good deeds, right? Now, all neural activity that results in voluntary action eventually has to stimulate the spinal cord, right? It has to stimulate the spinal cord, which begins at the brain stem, and stimulate the right nerve endings connected to the right muscles in order to produce a voluntary action, right? So we should start, the authors reason, in brain areas that have exclusive control over what kinds of representations get to the spinal cord, and that area is the motor cortex together with premotor cortical areas. Just real quick, here they're talking about representations, mental representations, which are mentally stored information. This could be about the environment, about one's body, could be beliefs and desires, but that's what a representation is, a mental representation, that is, internally stored information. And we can talk about, more, we can talk about motor representations being the, I guess, the signals that fire that actually cause us to move, and then other kinds of mental representations like beliefs and desires and that stuff. So where the authors want to start is with the motor cortex and the premotor cortical areas. Premotor cortical areas, they divide into these different subregions, and each control neurons in different areas of the motor cortex. So each of these premotor areas sort of feeds into a different area of the motor cortex. So you can think of it as being analogous to a keyboard, right? We have low pitch notes, we have high pitch notes in different parts of the keyboard. And we can put these together to form more complicated chords, groups of notes that follow specific patterns. So in terms of motor representations and actions, simple movements might be like sequences of notes, a simple melody, whereas more complicated movements are more like chords. They're made up of all these simple movements, and all of them come together in the motor cortex from different precortical areas, which might be like the different fingers activating different keys on a keyboard, if you like a musical analogy. So complex body movements, like the kinds of complex body movements like Jen carried out, reaching into her pocket and pulling out $1 and giving it to the homeless man. Well, those premotor cortical areas must be under some kind of higher control. So where do we look for these areas of higher control in the brain? Well, we've mentioned that in previous lectures, I mean in particular the last lecture, that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex plays a role in executive control. But, and this is important, it turns out that there's actually no single region in the brain that controls the motor cortex, right? There's inputs from various regions of the brain, various cortical and subcortical areas. I'll talk a little bit about what that means in a moment. And these various inputs control different areas of the premotor cortex, which in turn control different areas of the motor cortex, which in turn produces different kinds of behaviors, right? So we've got our cortical areas and our subcortical areas. Well, what does that mean? Well, inputs that come from cortical areas we'll call cortical inputs, and anything cortical refers to the cortex, right? The outer layer of the brain. This is the part of the brain, if you see a picture of a brain or a brain in a vat kind of thing, that lumpy, smushed up, folded sort of structure on the outside of the brain, that's the cortex, right? That's the cerebral cortex, made of predominantly made up of gray matter. And inputs from areas in the cortex are like perceptual inputs, so stuff that underwrites our senses, and also higher level cognitive kind of stuff. So we're talking about the kinds of things, the kinds of mental machinery, I'm calling it, that allows me to reach out and grasp this coffee cup, to understand a sentence, or to recognize a face, high level stuff. Subcortical inputs, these come from, as the name implies, subcortical areas. So motor output structures in the basal ganglia, and possibly also areas that suppress certain actions in premotor cortical areas too. So not just excitatory inputs, but inhibitory inputs come from the subcortical regions. And they go to the motor basal ganglia. And the motor basal ganglia is really interesting because there are 4 different sources that kind of feed into the motor basal ganglia. There are the cortical regions, activity in the motor and premotor cortices, input from the brain's reward system, and the structure of the basal ganglia itself. So all of these different cortical and subcortical regions are kind of feeding into this premotor areas, which feed into the motor areas, which feed into the motor basal ganglia, and from there down the spinal cord and to the rest of the body. And that is basically how we can go from, brain states to actions, right? So let's look at these different kinds of inputs, cortical and subcortical, in more detail to the motor basal ganglia. So input from cortical regions. Well, that's cognition. This is higher level stuff. This is all stuff that has to do with beliefs and desires. So representations of beliefs, representations of perhaps rules of reasoning, moral beliefs, moral desires, and other kinds of desires more generally, even perceptual beliefs. So a moral belief would be something to do with what is right or what is wrong. A perceptual belief would be your beliefs about what's going on, at your present time, just based on what you're perceiving. For example, I believe that there is a lamp next to me right now. I'm not sure you can see it in frame, but my belief that there is a lamp there is sort of based on my perception of the lamp, right? I'm seeing a lamp there, therefore I believe there's a lamp there. That's a perceptual belief. And these could become important when you're dealing with the representations of what's going on in your immediate environment, when you're motivated to perform a moral act or not perform a moral act. So, we have to select an action, but we can't select it without information about the world. We also can't select an action without bringing moral beliefs to bear on thinking about what we should do or what actions we should take. So that's why beliefs and desires, perceptual beliefs, moral beliefs, intrinsic desires, moral desires are all important here. Let's talk about activity in the premotor and motor cortices and what that does. Well, the brain has something that we call an action selection system, and it's differentially sensitive to information about what actions it's released in the past and what actions it is prepared to release now. So it uses this information, what have we done in the past in similar circumstances, and what could we do now to select the appropriate action to take given the circumstances. So that's what activity in the premotor and motor cortices is doing that feeds into the motor basal ganglia. What about the brain's reward system? We hear a lot about this reward system, or sometimes the pleasure reward system. How does that figure into all of this? Well, this is really interesting. The reward system is selectively activated when we obtain a reward, like food or cooperation with others, or when we accomplish something important. The activation of the reward system elicits a pleasurable sensation, and that's because of the release of dopamine. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter, basically a chemical messenger that affects how information flows through these synaptic connections. So dopamine regulates this feeling of pleasure. A lot of drugs attach to our dopamine receptors and mess with dopamine reuptake, and that's why drugs can feel good, right? Like cocaine attaches to dopamine receptor sites, which can cause a sense of pleasure or euphoria, but also can really mess with your pleasure reward system. So don't do drugs, kids. It'll mess up your pleasure reward system. The pleasure reward system is supposed to activate and release dopamine when we do things that are good for us. Like if I enjoy a fine meal, I'll get some dopamine pumping through my brain, and it'll make enjoying that fine meal even finer. Or say you complete this class and you get an A+, you'll probably feel a rush of dopamine when you check your final grades and see that you did really well. And that will motivate you in the future to keep doing the same kinds of things, right? Eat good food, get good grades, practice the guitar a lot. That's what the reward system is for. It's to reward us for doing the things that are good for us, right? So how does this all fit into the neurophysiology of moral motivation? Well, the reward system actually influences action selection on this kind of moment-to-moment basis, right? So it has a baseline of activity, but that baseline can rise or fall. And actions are produced regardless of the activity level, so it's not like you need to have a high baseline of activity to do things, or if you're having a day where you have your pleasure reward system is baseline activity is very low. It's not like you'll be lazy all day. But what happens is changes in this level can affect the likelihood that you'll perform a particular action, right? So positive reward information, as you probably guessed, like the release of dopamine, plays a role in increasing the likelihood of increasing a rewarding behavior later on, or a rewarding action later on. So if I practice really hard and play a song on stage and the audience really likes it, that'll trigger my dopamine pleasure response, and that'll make me practice harder and want to do this again in the future and do even better next time. But if I do a terrible job, or even if the audience maybe isn't into the music I'm playing and I don't get the response I want, well, maybe I won't get as strong of a reward, and I won't be as primed, or maybe that's not the best way to put it, but I won't be as likely next time to undertake the same kind of action because I didn't get a very nice dopamine reward the last time I did it, right? So, there are also multiple streams of influence upon reward signals. That's important to mention. High level and low level, and here we're talking levels of analysis again, or levels of abstraction. We've got high level stuff like perception and cognition, so specific representations of specific rewards. If I do action X, I'll get $20. So representations like this move through the ventromedial prefrontal cortex to the reward system, so that if I, say, form the belief that if I participate in a study, I'll get $20, and then when I finally get that $20 and my expectation is satisfied, I'll get a reward, a dopamine reward, right? There's low-level stuff too, and this is like strong, like old, in evolutionary terms, old emotional responses, stuff that's subserved by the amygdala, parts of the limbic system, or the lizard brain, as it's sometimes called. This is old. I say old, evolutionary speaking, because this is a brain structure we share with reptiles and amphibians and stuff. It's old because this kind of brain structure has existed in animal life on Earth longer than the cortex has, right? Mammals have cortexes or cortices. Reptiles have, big limbic systems as brains, whereas when mammals evolved, more brain parts, that's an incredibly crude way to put it, but more brains evolved on top of our older brains, right? So that's what I mean when I say that the limbic system is an old part of the brain. And here we're talking about stuff like classical conditioning, like if you train an animal to fear a certain stimulus, or to salivate when it hears a bell, or something like that, right? I'll link a video when it comes to this stuff, that Modern Understanding of the Mind video, in case that would be helpful here, because although that was a lecture from another class, I think I do talk about a lot of stuff that I'm kind of glossing over here, so if you find that helpful, I'll link it up here. In any case, we've got high-level cognitive and perceptual stuff, we've got low-level, like old, almost like instinctual stuff, or the kinds of responses that you'd see in cases of classical conditioning or operant conditioning, that kind of stuff. This can feed into the reward system, into the motor basal ganglia, and ultimately produce or inhibit action. Finally, there's the internal structure of the motor basal ganglia itself. Research shows that this area of the brain is where representations that underwrite unconscious behavioral habits are stored. So these are called embodied representations by the textbook, and I think what they mean there is that these representations are embodied in the sense that they are literally certain neural connections, patterns of connection and firing patterns within those connections. So that's how these are represented. Indeed, this is how I would imagine other kinds of mental representations are realized in the brain. They're embodied in this way, in that they are embodied in particular patterns of connections and particular patterns of neurons firing within those patterns of connections. So, okay, where was I? Oh, well, that nearly covers it for the neurophysiology of moral motivation. These are all the kinds of things that feed into this chain of going from a belief or a desire to producing an action. And if you find all of this a little bit hard to follow, what I will do is share I will share figure 3.1, or at least draw your attention there. I'll put it here on the screen as well. But figure 3.1 does a really good job of showing or mapping out the cortical and subcortical regions and how the information is flowing. So there's one of these box diagrams in figure 3.1 on page 80. Again, I'll put it up here. Study it as you're reading through this, because it'll give you an idea of how information is flowing through these neural systems, subcortical and cortical. So that does it for the neurophysiology of moral motivation. So far we've talked about the reward system, the structure of the motor basal ganglia, different kinds of subcortical and cortical inputs to the motor basal ganglia. This gives you an idea of the nuts and bolts of how all of this is realized in the brain. I've been saying realized, this is what we mean by realization, is that I guess you could think of this is how all of this information processing stuff is actually implemented in the brain. That's what I mean by how it is realized. You could make something like this, maybe some kind of moral motivation system, and run it on a computer if you wanted to, or in a robot. That would be a different way of realizing an approximation of this system. And indeed, my neurons are arranged in different patterns and firing in different patterns than your neurons are. So even though we may be employing a similar, set of information processing systems in cases of moral motivation and the production of morally good deeds, ours aren't going to look exactly alike if you could look at them neuron by neuron, right? So even though your moral motivation system and my moral motivation system are both realized in a brain, our brains are not exactly the same, right? So that's what I mean by realization here, or realizability. Anyway, so much for the physiology or neurophysiology of moral motivation. Let's talk about the implications of the neurophysiology on the four philosophical accounts of moral motivation that we discussed previously. All right, so what are some of the implications of the neurophysiological findings that we've just discussed for instrumentalism? Well, remember, on instrumentalism, there has to be some kind of intrinsic desire realized somewhere in the brain, because we need intrinsic desires on the instrumentalist account. Remember, you need the right kind of intrinsic desires coupled with the right kinds of occurrent beliefs and instrumental desires to do moral deeds. So to have moral motivation, you need the right kinds of intrinsic desires. Therefore, we need intrinsic desires to be realized somewhere in the brain. And a good candidate brain system for this is the reward system. So if I desire that P, for example, I must have a representation of P. And the reward system might underwrite all of this by subserving this desire that P in a way that motivates me to bring about P, right? You see what I'm saying? So maybe because I anticipate pleasure at the prospect of accomplishing P, or at P obtaining or becoming the case, maybe that could serve as a motivation or some kind of instrumental desire that's important for my intrinsic desire, which is also, on this account, must be realized somewhere in the brain. Intrinsic desires also have to combine with the beliefs I mentioned earlier, the occurrent beliefs. So the instrumentalist needs to identify neural structures or functional regions in the brain by which the reward system can interact with a higher order cognitive states. In this case, those would be like my occurrent beliefs and my intrinsic desires, or instrumental desires even. So one good candidate for this would be the motor basal ganglia, because information from higher cognitive centers combines with other information about perception and motor commands and reward information at the motor basal ganglia. So remember, on instrumentalism, when intrinsic desires combine with the right kind of beliefs, we get a motivational state, a psychological state of motivation. So these intrinsic desires and beliefs are combined, it seems, on an instrumentalist reading of this neurophysiology that we've just covered, are combined by the motor basal ganglia, and that releases the appropriate motor commands like reaching into your pocket to give a homeless man $1. These structures have the properties that an instrumentalist would need to give a neurophysiological account of an instrumentalist view of moral motivation. They can represent occurrent causal states that are distinct from intrinsic desires and beliefs that are involved in the production of action. They can also represent instrumental desires, or our instrumental desires can be realized in machinery that all feeds into the motor basal ganglia, in essence. That's the key takeaway here. So this neurophysiological stuff that we've just covered should be very satisfying to an instrumentalist, because an instrumentalist is able here to identify the mental machinery, as I've been calling it, necessary to realize what an instrumentalist takes as necessary and sufficient for motivation to count as moral, right? We have the right kinds of, we have ways to represent and combine the right kinds of occurrent beliefs and intrinsic desires and instrumental desires here with all of this neurophysiological stuff we've covered. So instrumentalists will be pretty happy about that. But what about cognitivists? Well, remember that cognitivists needs there to be the right kinds of beliefs, beliefs that are moral and have the causal power to produce motivational states that are independent of intrinsic desires or any kind of antecedent desire. So a cognitivist needs for there to be beliefs realized in higher cognitive centers to directly influence motivational states. Because remember, for cognitivism, it's all about the belief and not the intrinsic desire. Therefore, a cognitivist also seems to have what they want here in terms of the neurophysiology. They have higher cognitive centers wherein beliefs are realized, and they have the interaction of these representations with motivational states that are realized in the basal ganglia and in premotor areas and in motor areas. So the authors say this is certainly possible given the mental machinery we've surveyed and what it does. Hi, come on, hello. And they say further that there's no reason why it cannot be the case that it actually works this way. In fact, an instrumentalist and a cognitivist will both agree on what all of this neural architecture or mental architecture actually does. They would just disagree about how moral motivation actually comes to occur. So an instrumentalist will say something like, intrinsic beliefs are pervasive. The cognitivist would argue that instead these intrinsic beliefs might be like a low-level, ancient, evolutionarily old system that is often overridden by higher-level beliefs. And each of these possibilities entails different empirical predictions or different empirical hypotheses that we could test. So I guess to sum all of this up, at least when it comes to cognitivism versus instrumentalism, both camps agree on what everything in the brain is doing, or what its functional role, what the functional role of the motor basal ganglia is, and what cortical and subcortical areas, what their functional roles are. They just disagree about how it all comes together, and about what counts as a case of moral motivation. So there's a little bit of philosophical, conceptual stuff to iron out here in terms of the differences that remain between these two camps, but there's also some empirical predictions that could be tested, and will be tested in the years to come. Again, perhaps one of you will be able to conduct some work in this area that will help us to adjudicate between these different possibilities. You never know. All right, moving on to sentimentalism. Some of the implications of this neurophysiological stuff for sentimentalism. Well, remember that on sentimentalism, it's our emotions, our sentiments, particularly moral emotions, not beliefs nor intrinsic desires that are at center stage here, right? So on a first pass, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot here when it comes to this neural architecture that supports a sentimentalist position. But if we look closer, we can identify some important bits of neural architecture that might be helpful for a sentimentalist account, or at least that a sentimentalist might be pleased with here. For example, we have the reward system. It gets a lot of its inputs from the limbic system, and the limbic system, again, an evolutionary old part of the brain, is very important when it comes to emotion processing. So, the amygdala, which I mentioned a little while ago, and indeed the basal ganglia itself, they're both part of the limbic system, and the amygdala receives inputs from different perceptual and cognitive functional regions in the brain. And it produces output that can affect changes in things like heart rate, pupil dilation, electrodermal activity, or sometimes that's called galvanic skin response. It's the kind of thing you'd measure with a galvanometer. The kind of thing that's measured during a lie detector test, in fact. And it basically has to do with the amount you're sweating, which is elicited by an emotional response, causes you to sweat, which affects the electrical conductivity of your skin. It can also produce outputs that generate changes in our subjective sense of pleasure or displeasure, unconscious facial expressions that we make, and indeed other outputs to the reward system. And all of these outputs that the amygdala produces as a result of the inputs that it receives from perceptual and cognitive centers in the brain are the kinds of things that play a role in the emotions, the range of emotions that we can experience. As we'll see next week, emotions have a lot to do with what's going on in the body, and one of the essential characteristics of emotions is that there's something that it's like to experience them. And that seems to be what differentiates what it's like to experience one emotion from another, is at least in part due to how it feels, right? And what's going on physiologically. Is your heart beating fast or slow? Are you breathing heavily or not heavily? Are you sweating or not sweating? Are you feeling pleasure or displeasure, right? All of these somatic things play a role in kind of differentiating one emotion from another, in addition to other things like what are sometimes called core relational themes and so on and so forth. But we'll talk about all of that next week. So being that the amygdala, the outputs of the amygdala can play a role in regulating all of these different somatic things, it's no surprise that many people think it plays a role in emotions. A lot of the emotions that we've studied when it comes to, or a lot of the emotions that it seems that the amygdala plays a role in that have been well studied are basic or universal emotions. There are 6 of those identified by Ekman in the 1960s, I believe. Anger, disgust, fright, sadness, joy, and surprise. So the amygdala's role in anger and disgust and stuff is something that's been particularly studied, and indeed people with people with a greater propensity to erupt in these angry fits have structurally different amygdalas. Psychopaths, for example, have a diminished fear response, and they tend to have smaller amygdalas than you or I would, which is very interesting. So the point is here that the sentimentalist can also find support for their account of moral motivation in the neurophysiological literature, just like an instrumentalist can, and just like a cognitivist can. Now, what about a personalist? Well, remember that on personalism, we need beliefs about what is good, and we need also, in addition to the right kinds of beliefs, we need long-standing dispositions to act in good ways, character traits to behave in certain ways. Basically, these complexes which have traditionally been called virtues. So we should expect things like virtues, if they are indeed real, or if character traits and similar things are indeed real, to be realized in higher level. Oh, excuse me, coffee is required. We should expect these things to be realized in higher level cognitive and perceptual centers. The outputs from these areas could plausibly feed into the reward system, providing some kind of basis for moral motivation that would be compatible with a personal account. When it comes with a personalist account, I should say, oh boy, I feel like I've got aphasia today. My words are just not coming out properly. Well, that about covers it for these, kind of higher level neurophysiological goings on and personalism. But what about lower level neural processes? Well, lower level neurological, neurophysiological type stuff may still be be of some import to a personalist. This could be how our habits are realized, for example, as representations in the motor basal ganglia. So on a personalist account, we need these long-standing, kind of dispositions and habits to act in certain ways. Habits of a person with good character or a virtuous person. Those could be represented in low-level structures or parts of our neural architecture, like the motor basal ganglia. So the personalist ought to be as comfortable with the neurophysiological findings as a sentimentalist or a cognitivist or an instrumentalist. In other words, it seems that all four of these different theories or theorists who belong in one of these four camps would all agree, according to the authors, on what parts of our mental architecture or neural machinery are involved in moral motivation. They would all agree about that. Where they would disagree would be, firstly, on the one hand, how these neural structures actually work in concert with one another to produce moral motivation. And we've seen that in our considerations over this last sort of subsection of this video lecture. And secondly, on the other hand, they would disagree about what psychological states, that is beliefs, desires, propositional attitudes, or possible character traits or patterns of behavior, habits, dispositions to act in certain ways, those kinds of things, would make something count as moral. So on the one hand, again, they would disagree about how the particulars of all of this neural machinery and how it all works in concert with one another actually happens. And they would disagree, on the other hand, kind of more philosophically or theoretically with one another about what it is that makes something count as moral. What makes motivation count as moral? Is it the right kind of belief, the right kind of desire, or is it something more holistic, like the right kind of personality traits, collections of virtues and dispositions, behavioral habits, and so on and so forth? So there's a lot of agreement here and a lot of disagreement here, and the jury is still out on which of these frameworks offers the best account of moral motivation. All right, now that about covers it for what I wanted to talk about in today's lecture. I've covered sections 1 to 4 of this chapter. I believe there's a 5th section that I have decided not to cover. Feel free to read it if you're interested. I'm much more interested in the interdisciplinary neurophysiological stuff meets the philosophical stuff, which is why I've decided to stick to mostly the first and middle parts of this chapter. We also haven't really talked about some of the empirical predictions that each of these theories would make. That is sentimentalism, cognitivism, personalism, so on and so forth. But that's fine. That's something I'd be more than happy to tackle in the comments. In fact, I think that would be a good way for you all to participate a little bit, since we're not meeting in person. Let me know in the comments section, or send me an email, if you can derive any predictions from any of these 4 accounts, and perhaps how we might go about looking for them neurophysiologically. One thing we have talked about a lot is how to combine all of these different levels of analysis. Philosophical reasoning, psychological studies, neurological studies, and all of the methodologies involved in these disparate disciplines to investigate a single thing, and that is moral motivation. What makes motivation count as specifically moral? And again, that's what really gets me excited about moral psychology and about interdisciplinary work in general. The philosophy is great on its own, it really is, but I always think this kind of philosophy is best when it's empirically informed, and I love getting interdisciplinary with stuff like this. So, as we'll see, and as I've said before, much of what we're going to cover in this book is interdisciplinary in the exact same way, combining various levels of analysis and theoretical stuff with more applied empirical stuff. It's just great. I mean, you can tell by how much I'm nerding out over this, just how fun interdisciplinary work actually is. And I hope that this proves to be contagious for all of you guys. I hope you see the value at any rate in doing this kind of interdisciplinary work. In any case, philosophy is, especially in the present day, it tends to be very empirically informed. So even if you're not going to go out and start doing experiments anytime soon, it would be good to get familiar with how empirical scientists do what they do. And I hope that these little breadcrumbs I'm dropping throughout the course will help you to gain an appreciation for that. And of course, if you have any more specific questions about how this kind of empirical work is carried out, let me know. I mean, this is a philosophy class, but I am a cognitive scientist by training. And I'm more than happy to talk about the empirical side of things as we go. So that about does it for today. The next lecture will be on moral emotion. So that's chapter 4. It's also a fun one. Make sure you study up for it. And I'll be making announcements soon regarding the midterm. And I'll also be introducing a poll on CU Learn. I'd like you all to answer this poll. It's going to ask you about whether I should do follow-up videos to my lectures to address unanswered questions. Or, rather, when someone emails me or lets me know in the comments, I can answer their question. But I think it'd be cool if I was able to answer everybody's question in a way that's just easier for everyone to see. So I've been thinking about doing these follow-up videos, and I'll say a little bit more about how I envision these being. But in any case, I'll describe what I have in mind to you, and I'll put it to a vote. And if enough of the class thinks this would be a good idea, then I will do it, and you can all leave your questions in the comment sections, and I will post follow-up lectures that address these questions. And that way it'll be a bit more like we're in class, and if someone raises their hand and I answer their question, everyone else hears the question and the answer, and everybody benefits. So stay tuned for these announcements, and in the meantime, stay safe, keep on studying. The second quiz is now up, so you can go ahead and complete that if you like, and stay tuned for announcements about the midterm. In the meantime, take care, and I will see you all next time.